Harold Bennett walked slowly through the airport hallway, his wooden cane tapping gently against the polished tile floor, each step echoing like memories scattered across a lifetime of service. He wore an old military jacket, its faded patches telling stories long etched into history. Beneath the brim of his worn-out cap was a face lined with age, his thin white hair fluttering lightly in the cool draft of the air conditioning. His eyes, though weary from the years, still held a glint of pride, one that time had not managed to steal away. The flight to Seattle wasn't a big deal to him. It was just a journey to attend a reunion honoring his old military unit. A unit that had sweat, bled, and cried together in places most people would rather forget. Harold was never one to seek praise or fanfare, but he understood the importance of being there. If he didn't show up, there might be no one left to tell the stories. Stories of sacrifice that the younger generation needed to hear. When he reached boarding gate, he handed his ticket to a young attendant named Samantha. Her smile lasted only a heartbeat before it faded into a stiff professionalism barely veiled in politeness. "I'm sorry, sir, but your ticket isn't valid for this flight," she said flatly. Harold furrowed his brow, trying to remain calm. "That can't be right. I booked this a month ago. Seat 22A. Samantha glanced at the ticket again and shrugged with visible annoyance. "That seat's already been given to another passenger. You'll have to step aside while we sort this out." Harold didn't raise his voice. He had seen war. He knew patience was a form of strength. With a slight nod, he stepped aside, leaning on his cane as a steady stream of travelers passed him by, some avoiding his gaze, some casting pitying looks, but none stopping to offer help. Not far away stood a man in his mid-30s, dressed simply in a black hoodie and jeans. He looked like just another traveler, but in fact, he was Andrew Taylor, the owner of Taylor Aviation, the airline Harold was trying to board. Andrew often traveled incognito, blending in with passengers to observe how his staff treated people, and something about the way Samantha was handling this situation didn't sit right with him. "It's going to be a hassle," he overheard her whisper to a coworker. "Better not let him on." Andrew's jaw clenched. He had dealt with ruthless boardrooms and corporate backstabbing, but what he couldn't tolerate was a lack of respect for human dignity, especially toward someone like Harold. Harold remained where he stood, hands trembling slightly as they rested on the head of his cane. Time dragged on, minute by minute, as passengers continued to board. Finally, Samantha returned with a blank, rehearsed expression. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett. The flight is overbooked. We won't be able to seat you today." Harold frowned. "I need to be there. I'm not asking for favors, just the seat I paid for." Samantha's tone shifted, the veneer of respect wearing thin. "Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. We can rebook you for tomorrow." Nearby, a small boy tugged at his mother's arm, pointing at Harold's jacket and whispering something about the medals. The mother gave Harold an uncomfortable smile before ushering her son away. No one stopped. They saw him, but no one truly saw him. Andrew had seen enough. He stepped forward, his voice calm yet firm. "Excuse me. What seems to be the problem here?" Samantha flinched slightly, startled, but quickly regained her composure. "Oh, no problem. We're assisting this passenger." "Assisting him by denying him his seat?" Andrew asked, locking eyes with her. Harold glanced over at the young man who had spoken up, visibly surprised. For a moment, he seemed ready to wave him off. "It's all right, son. I'm used to this. I'll manage," he said, his voice steady but undeniably tired. But Andrew wasn't swayed by Harold's humility. He wasn't the kind to turn a blind eye to injustice, and something told him this situation wasn't just a clerical error. "Has a valid ticket, doesn't he?" Andrew asked, calmly but pointedly. Samantha hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Yes, but then he should be allowed to board," Andrew cut in, his voice firming. "Overbooking is the airline's mistake, not his." Samantha flushed, struggling to maintain her professionalism. "I'll look into it," she said quickly, and turned away to avoid Andrew's gaze. Andrew turned to Harold and offered a small, reassuring smile. "I'm Andrew. Mind if I stay here a while, just to make sure they don't give ye any more trouble?" Harold chuckled, a dry laugh tinged with fatigue. "Suit yourself. I appreciate it." As they waited, Andrew began a quiet conversation with Harold, filled with genuine respect. Under the cold lights of the airport, Harold spoke modestly of his life, how he'd served during the Korean War, and how this trip was just to pay respect to the few remaining members of his old unit. He didn't go into detail, didn't brag, but Andrew could sense the weight of unspoken memories, the sacrifices, the losses, and the quiet loneliness only someone who had truly lived through it could understand. A short while later, Samantha returned, her face tense. "We can get you on the flight," she said, "but the only seat left is at the back row, next to the restroom." Harold dipped his head slightly. There was a hint of disappointment in his eyes, but he nodded. "That'll do, thank you." Andrew wasn't satisfied. "That's not acceptable," he said, voice sharp. "He paid for a specific seat. Treating him like this is disrespectful." Samantha forced a tight smile. "It's the best we can do." Andrew clenched his jaw, nearly revealing who he really was to call out the injustice, but something stopped him, an instinct that this story had more layers yet to unfold. Harold walked slowly toward the boarding gate. Andrew followed behind, his mind spinning. There was something oddly familiar about the old man, a feeling he couldn't shake. When Harold stumbled slightly, dropping his worn canvas bag, Andrew immediately bent down to help. That's when he saw it, a glint of old polished metal catching the overhead lights. The metal, he picked it up, breath catching as he read the inscription, "Distinguished Service Cross." Andrew froze. He had seen this medal before, on the mantle of his late grandfather, Richard Taylor, a fellow veteran who often spoke of a man who had saved his life in Korea. A man named Harold Bennett. Could it really be the same Harold? Hands trembling, Andrew returned the medal to Harold, overwhelmed by the possibility. They boarded the plane. Harold took his cramped seat near the restroom without complaint. Andrew sat a few rows ahead, but his thoughts remained with the quiet soldier behind him. Now more than ever convinced, this was no ordinary passenger. This was the man who had once saved his grandfather's life, and Andrew was determined to learn the rest of the story. The plane began, taxiing down the runway, its engines roaring like echoes from history. Andrew stood up, stretching casually near the aisle. As he approached Harold, he hesitated. "Mind if I sit here for a bit?" Andrew asked, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. Harold opened his eyes, squinting slightly from the overhead light, then gave a small nod. "As long as you don't mind the smell back here," he said, with a faint chuckle, though curiosity glimmered in his eyes. "The smell's a bit unique in this section," Harold added half-jokingly, motioning toward the nearby restroom. Andrew laughed as he sat down next to him. "I've been through worse," he replied. After a beat, his tone shifted. "That medal you're carrying, it's a Distinguished Service Cross, isn't it?" Howell stirred slightly, surprise flickering in his eyes. His fingers instinctively reached toward the pocket where the medal was stored, feeling the cold metal through the fabric. "Not many people recognize it these days," he said, voice low and distant. "My grandfather had one," Andrew said, keeping his voice gentle as if afraid to break the fragile moment. "He used to tell me stories about the men he fought alongside, the ones he called the real heroes." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Harold's mouth. "Then, your grandfather was probably one of them." Andrew paused, choosing his words carefully. "He talked a lot about someone named Harold Bennett. Said if it weren't for him, he wouldn't have lived to start a family." Harold's expression shifted instantly. The smile faded, replaced with something deeper, thoughtful, heavy. "Richard Taylor," he whispered as if calling back a piece of himself. "I remember him. Fine soldier. Good man." Andrew felt his chest tighten. That's my grandfather. Harold turned fully to face him, his aged eyes now sharp and focused. You Richard's grandson? Andrew nodded, emotion rising in his throat. He told me about the time you saved his life. Said he owed you everything. Harold was silent for a long while, eyes falling to his thin, weathered hands. Your grandfather was braver than he gave himself credit for. He held our unit together when everything was falling apart. We lost a lot of good men out there. Andrew didn't interrupt. He let the silence settle, heavy but respectful. After a moment, he asked quietly, "Why didn't he ever tell me what you did?" Harold gave a faint, humorless chuckle. Men like your grandfather didn't like to look back. They didn't want their families to carry that weight. As for me, I did what I had to do. That's all. Andrew shook his head slowly. Not everyone would have done what you did. Harold shrugged. Maybe not, but it's not something I like to dwell on. And taken a seat. Their conversation was interrupted as Samantha approached. She still wore a professional mask, but her eyes had lost their earlier confidence. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat," she said to Andrew, her tone stiff. Andrew looked at her calmly. "I'm sitting in an empty seat. I'm not blocking the aisle." Samantha pressed her lips together. "It's against policy to sit near the laboratories for too long." Before Andrew could respond, Harold spoke up gently. "It's all right, son. Don't get in trouble on my account." Andrew stood, giving Harold a respectful nod. "I'll be back. We haven't finished our conversation." Back in his seat, Andrew's thoughts spun. There was no doubt now, Harold Bennett was the very man his grandfather had honored in his stories. But Andrew sensed there was more. Something Harold hadn't said yet. Something that still weighed on him. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his emails, quickly finding a recent message from the COO. It was about the company's new initiative to support veterans, a highly publicized campaign built on promises of dignity and honor. And yet, right there on his own aircraft, one of the most deserving veterans had just been treated like a burden. Andrew leaned back in his seat. A plan was beginning to form. He wouldn't just apologize. He was going to set things right. As the plane began its descent, Andrew got up again, ignoring the glances from flight attendants. He made his way to the back, crouched beside Harold, and spoke quietly. "When we land, would you let me buy you a cup of coffee? There's something I'd like to share." Harold raised an eyebrow, surprised but unbothered. "I reckon I've got the time, young man." "Sure." Andrew smiled, relief softening his features. Around them, the cabin buzzed with the usual pre-landing activity. But for Andrew, this small moment marked the beginning of something much greater. Even while still in the air, Andrew couldn't explain exactly why he felt so responsible for this man. Maybe it was because Harold had once saved his grandfather's life, but deeper than that, Harold represented something greater. A generation of silent sacrifice, slowly fading into the rush of modern life. As the wheels touched down and the cabin filled with the usual flurry of unbuckling seatbelts and shuffled footsteps, Andrew stayed by Harold's side, quietly resolved that before the day was done, Harold Bennett would receive the honor he had long deserved. At the baggage claim, the two men found a quiet corner in a small cafe near the exit. Harold sat down slowly, resting his cane against the table. Andrew placed a hot cup of coffee in front of him and took a seat across. For a while, neither of them spoke. Harold stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, eyes fixed on the swirling steam as if chasing a memory. Andrew leaned forward slightly, hands clasped on the table. "I meant what I said on the plane," he began, voice low and sincere. "I want to hear more about your story. My grandfather spoke about you often, but I don't think I ever really understood what you did for him." Harold looked up, his expression unreadable. "Your grandfather was a good man. He didn't need to make a fuss about me." Andrew shook his head, gaze unwavering. "But you saved his life, didn't you?" Harold sighed, setting down his spoon. "We saved each other. In war, you don't think about yourself, you think about the man next to you. That's how Richard and I made it out. Andrew nodded slowly, sensing Harold's reluctance to dive deeper. But there was more. Mentioned one day. A day that changed everything. He always spoke about it with a different look in his eyes. Harold's hand trembled slightly as he lifted the coffee cup. He took a long sip, then placed it gently down. His voice dropped, softer now. There was such a day, yes, the worst day of my life. And Drew stayed quiet. He knew Harold needed to decide how much to share. After a long pause, Harold began, his tone carrying the weight of memory. It was early 1951. We were deep behind enemy lines, cut off from reinforcements. The cold was brutal, food was running low, and morale was even lower. Our unit was ordered to hold a critical position, but truthfully it was a suicide mission, Andrew said, nearly breathless. His coffee, untouched since the beginning, sat cooling beside him. Richard and I were part of a reconnaissance team sent ahead, Harold continued. We walked straight into an ambush. Gunfire came from every direction. Half my team went down in the first few minutes. The rest of us scrambled for cover amid the chaos. Richard got hit in the leg. He was bleeding badly. We were pinned down, stuck. Harold paused, his grip tightening around the coffee cup. His eyes no longer met Andrew's. They stared into something only he could see. I had a choice. Leave him behind and try to save myself, or risk everything to drag him out of that hell. I didn't think. I just knew I couldn't leave him. I lifted him up and dragged him one step at a time through enemy fire. My body was numb, my head spinning, but somehow we made it back. Andrew felt his chest tighten. He had read about war in books, seen it in movies, but never had it felt this real. This close, this painful, sitting quietly in a cafe with a man from another generation. And that's how I earned the Distinguished Service Cross, Harold said softly, his voice trembling, though his eyes remained steady. He fell silent for a moment, as if seeing the faces of the past in a fog only he could peer into. But the medal wasn't for saving Richard. That was just the beginning. The real battle came when the enemy launched an all-out assault. We were outnumbered, 10-1. Andrew remained still, his throat tight. When our lieutenant was killed, I was the only one left who could take command. We held that hill for hours until reinforcements arrived. That's what earned me the medal, but the price was the men I couldn't bring back. Andrew bowed his head, voice thick. You say it like it was nothing, but it wasn't. You saved lives, including my grandfather's. Harold looked up, his eyes sharp like steel forged in fire. I did what had to be done, but the truth is, I've carried the weight of that day ever since. The faces of the ones I couldn't save never left me. No medal erases that. The silence that followed was heavier than words. The coffee had long gone cold, but the story between them warmed the air. Andrew exhaled deeply. I think my grandfather understood that. He always told me, the bravest men are the ones who carry the heaviest burdens and keep walking anyway. Harold gave a faint smile. Richard always had a way with words. Andrew hesitated, then spoke, softly but with conviction. There's something I haven't told you. I'm not just a passenger on that flight. I'm the founder and CEO of Taylor Aviation. Harold didn't react at first. His eyes just widened slightly as he waited for the rest. I started this airline to honor my grandfather, a man who taught me integrity and that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, Andrew said, his voice beginning to shake. And today I failed. My staff made you feel like a burden. That's unacceptable. Harold lifted his hand gently. You don't have to apologize for them, son. It wasn't your fault. Andrew shook his head firmly. Yes, I do, because ultimately the responsibility is mine. I can't let something like this happen again. Not to you, not to any veteran who served this country. Harold looked into Andrew's eyes. This time not just with gratitude, but with recognition. Your grandfather, he'd be proud of you. he said softly. From there, the conversation softened. Harold opened up more about his time with Richard, the half-shared rations, the laughs in freezing nights, the time they nearly got buried under snow during a shelling. Andrew listened, captivated, like a grandson hearing the part of a family story that had always remained in shadow. Time passed quickly until Harold glanced at his watch and slowly stood with his cane. "I've kept you too long." "You haven't kept me. You've passed something on," Andrew replied, standing with him, a respectful smile on his face. "But there's one last thing I want to do." "What's that?" "Wait here," Andrew said and quickly stepped away. A few minutes later, he returned with a female representative from Taylor Aviation, who handed Harold a neatly sealed envelope embossed with the company's logo. Andrew placed a hand gently on Harold's shoulder. "This is a lifetime flight pass. First class. Every time. Wherever you want to go. It's the least I can do to thank you. Not just for saving my grandfather, but for serving this country." Harold froze. His eyes welled up, but he let out a soft laugh. You didn't have to do that, son." "It's not because I have to," Andrew said. "It's because I want to. Think of it as a debt my family never got to repay." Harold looked down at the envelope, then up at Andrew. His voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you. Thank you for everything." They shook hands, a handshake that was more than just formal. It was a connection between two men, two generations, bridging loss and redemption with simple humanity. When Harold left the cafe, his figure slowly disappeared into the moving crowd. But for Andrew, the story would never leave him. It hadn't just changed a day, it had reshaped his future. That day, Andrew didn't just make peace with the past. He made a promise that every passenger, every veteran, every soul who stepped onto one of his planes would be welcomed with the deepest respect. A medal can be hidden in a pocket, but true honor has to live in the hearts of the living. Courage, sacrifice, and loss. Those things left a permanent mark on Andrew's soul. As they walked slowly through the bustling terminal, Andrew couldn't help but notice something that tightened his chest. No one in the crowd seemed to recognize Harold, a man who once risked everything to protect the very freedoms people now rushed past without thinking. He was a shadow in the crowd, a hero forgotten by time. Andrew clenched his jaw as he recalled the flight attendant's dismissive eyes, her cold voice as she denied Harold boarding. That someone who had served this country could be treated as if he no longer mattered was a failure far greater than policy. "Harold," Andrew said as they approached the exit, "I know you may not want to revisit the past, but have you ever shared your story publicly?" Harold chuckled softly, leaning slightly on his worn wooden cane. "Not much, son. Seems to me people don't want to hear about wars anymore. They've got enough of their own problems to deal with." Andrew shook his head. "I think you're wrong. Your story has value, real value. If people understood the sacrifices veterans like you made, they'd treat you, and others like you, with the respect you deserve." Harold shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Respect isn't something you demand, it's something you have to earn." Andrew stopped and turned to face him. "And you have earned it, 100 times over. Not just for yourself, but for every veteran who's ever been forgotten. Your story speaks for an entire generation." Harold looked at him silently, as if weighing the truth behind Andrew's words. "You really mean that?" Andrew nodded. "I'm completely serious. I'm going to turn my airline into a symbol of honoring veterans. And you're the one who inspired me to do it." That evening, Andrew sat in his office, warm lamplight casting a glow over his desk as he wrote. He wasn't just thinking about Harold. He was thinking about everyone like him. The painful memories, the silent sacrifices. These deserved more than a simple thank you. They deserved action. When he was done, he gave the initiative a name. The Honor Flight Initiative. It wouldn't begin with grand gestures, but with small, meaningful steps. Priority boarding for veterans, complimentary upgrades when available, and personal thank yous to those who had served. But Andrew didn't stop there. He envisioned a storytelling platform, one where veterans could share their real experiences, connect with passengers, and breathe life into history through their words. A week later, Harold was invited back to the airport, this time not to catch a flight, but to meet with the executive team at Taylor Aviation. He entered the boardroom slowly, the soft tap of his cane echoing against the wood floor. He looked around, visibly confused by the many eyes fixed on him. "What's all this about?" he asked softly, leaning toward Andrew. Andrew smiled. "Harold, these are my senior leaders. I wanted them to hear your story. Straight from the one who lived it." Harold hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that." Andrew placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, his eyes steady. "There's no one more right than you." Harold took a seat at the head of the table, hands resting on his cane, and then he began to speak. Not with eloquence, but with authenticity. No embellishments, just truth and raw emotion. He spoke of brotherhood between soldiers, of losses too deep to name, and of the quiet pride in having served his country. He didn't hide the silences, those moments where old memories surfaced unexpectedly, but somehow his words reached everyone in the room. When he finished, no one said a word right away. The usual stoic expressions of executives had softened, many of them visibly moved. After the meeting, Andrew pulled Harold aside. "You made a big impact today." Harold gave a slight smile. "Maybe you're right. Telling that story felt like doing something for the ones who never got the chance to speak." Andrew nodded. "And this is just the beginning." He handed Harold a folder. As Harold opened it, his eyes widened. "All of this? It's real?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Andrew replied without hesitation. "It's real, and it's because of you, because of what you represent. I won't let another veteran feel the way you did." Harold clutched the folder, silent, perhaps holding back tears. Then, in a voice full of emotion, he said just 3 simple words. "Thank you, son." At this time, it was Andrew who choked up. "No, thank you for everything. When you were denied your seat that day, that's what sparked this program." Andrew said softly, "And this is how I want to honor you. And everyone like you." Harold's hand trembled slightly as he closed the folder. In his eyes, there was no longer surprise, only a deep, quiet emotion too powerful to name. "Thank you, Andrew. This is more than I ever thought possible," he whispered, voice cracking. Andrew gave him a warm, gentle smile. "You don't have to say anything. Just know your story made a difference, and it will continue to." A week after that meeting, the airline hosted a small ceremony to launch the Honor Flight initiative. The event was kept private, invitations sent only to select staff. Among them was Samantha, who received the invite with no clear context, assuming it was another routine training session. She walked into the conference room, scanning the unfamiliar faces, and then froze, her heart sinking, when she saw Harold Bennett sitting at the center, his cane resting by the table's edge. The memory of their brief, cold encounter at the boarding gate crashed over her, dragging a heavy wave of guilt with it. She quickly found a seat in the back, trying to remain unseen, hoping, somehow, this would all pass without notice. At the front of the room stood Andrew, casually dressed, but exuding quiet authority. Samantha didn't recognize him from the flight, let alone as the airline's CO. Andrew opened with a warm but weighty welcome. "Thank you all for being here. Today we're here to honor a man, someone who inspired not just a new program, but a new way of treating every passenger who walks onto our planes." Samantha glanced nervously toward Harold. He remained calm, expression unreadable, yet that very calmness made her feel smaller. Andrew continued, "Before we go any further, I want to introduce a special guest. This is Mr. Harold Bennett, a decorated veteran and someone who embodies courage, humility, and selfless service." Harold slowly stood, offering a small nod. The room filled with quiet, respectful applause. Samantha clapped hesitantly, her face flushed, her heart pounding. Harold began to speak. Not long, not flashy, just simple memories of comrades, missions, and losses that still lingered heavy in his heart. His voice was not loud, but it carried the kind of truth that needed no volume. When he sat down, Andrew took the floor again. This time, his tone sharpened. The Imagarian story shows us the immeasurable sacrifices made by so many, but it also shows us something else, that sometimes we overlook people's worth simply because we don't know who they are. His eyes scanned the room and landed squarely on Samantha. Her failures often come from ignorance, sometimes from assumptions, and sometimes from forgetting the most basic responsibility we have: to treat everyone with respect. He began walking forward. Samantha already knew. When he stopped directly in front of her, time seemed to stand still. "Samantha," he said, his voice firm, not harsh. "Do you remember Mr. Bennett?" She nodded, her lips trembling. "Yes. I remember." "And do you remember me?" Andrew asked. Samantha blinked. "You were a passenger on that flight." "I wasn't just a passenger," Andrew said, his voice suddenly sharp. "I'm Andrew Taylor, the founder and owner of this airline." The air in the room froze. Samantha stood stunned, her face drained of color. She couldn't speak. Andrew's tone remained steady. "You didn't know who I was, that's not important. But you also didn't know who Mr. Bennett was, and that is the real problem. You don't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect." Samantha opened her mouth to respond, but Andrew raised a hand to stop her. "I'm not here for excuses. Intent doesn't matter as much as actions. What happened that day wasn't just disrespect, it was a missed opportunity. An opportunity to honor someone who deserved far better." Samantha burst into tears, her voice choking. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I truly didn't know." Andrew's tone softened, his gaze becoming more thoughtful. "And that's exactly why we're here. Not to shame you, but to make sure this never happens again. Not just with Mr. Bennett, but with any veteran who has ever served this country." He turned to Harold and asked gently, "Would you like to say anything?" Harold looked at Samantha, his aged eyes calm and profound. His voice was gravelly yet steady. "We all make mistakes, young lady. What matters isn't the apology, it's what you do after. I don't need you to say sorry. I just need to know that you've learned something from this." Samantha nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I have. I promise. I'll do better." Andrew nodded. In that moment, he wasn't just a CEO. He was a man fulfilling a promise that no one would be forgotten simply because they were quiet. "Starting today," Andrew said, his voice ringing out in the silent room, "every member of our staff will undergo mandatory training on how to serve veterans and passengers with dignity. This isn't just a policy change, it's a commitment, a standard of ethics that we must live by." When the meeting ended, Samantha quietly approached Harold, her eyes full of emotion. "Mr. Bennett," she said softly, her voice nearly breaking, "I can't undo what happened, but I want you to know. Your story changed me. Thank you for teaching me a lesson I'll never forget." Harold smiled warmly, like a kind grandfather. "It's never too late to learn, young lady, and from what I've seen, you'll do just fine." Samantha left that room a different person, no longer a cold procedural employee, but a woman with gratitude in her heart, carrying the responsibility of honoring every veteran she would meet. 2 months later, the Honor Flight Initiative was fully implemented across Taylor Aviation's network. Veterans now received priority boarding, complimentary upgrades when available, and personalized greetings from crew members. The media praised it as a cultural shift. Veteran organizations sent letters of appreciation, and passengers shared the story like a ripple of inspiration. But for Andrew, one final thing remained: a surprise he had kept secret. That day, inside a grand hangar decorated for a special occasion, Harold arrived unsure of what to expect, still holding his familiar cane. Andrew greeted him with a firm handshake and a bright smile. "Good to see you again, Harold. You didn't tell me what all this was about," Harold said with a skeptical smile. Andrew just grinned. "You'll see soon enough." Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with excitement. Employees, veterans, and reporters filled the space. In the front row sat Samantha, now in a new uniform, eyes bright with purpose. She had become the program lead for Honor Flight, dedicated and passionate. Andrew stepped onto a small stage in front of a large aircraft hidden beneath a white drape. As the microphone crackled to life, the room fell silent. "Today, we're not just celebrating the success of a program," Andrew said. "We're celebrating people, those who sparked the change within our hearts." He turned to Harold. "Mr. Harold Bennett, with your courage, humility, and living testimony, you inspired us to do better, to be better. But words alone aren't enough to honor you." He gave a signal. The white drape fell. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Before them stood a brand new aircraft, painted with the image of a saluting soldier, set against the backdrop of the American flag waving across a blue sky. Along the fuselage, bold letters read, "Harold Bennett, a legacy of courage." Harold froze. He gripped his cane tightly, trying to steady himself. His eyes widened, and tears welled up without shame. Andrew stepped down from the stage and knelt beside him. "This plane is dedicated to you and every veteran who has ever served. Every time it takes off, it will carry your legacy with it." Harold struggled to find his voice, hoarse with emotion. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Andrew replied, smiling. "This is what you deserve." Samantha stepped forward, tears glistening in her eyes. "Mr. Bennett, I just want to thank you for your patience, your forgiveness, and for giving me the chance to grow. I'll never forget what you taught me." Harold placed a hand gently over hers, his warm smile returning. "You've done well, young lady. Keep going." The ceremony ended with thunderous applause. Harold and Andrew posed for photos in front of the aircraft, answered questions from reporters, but Harold remained humble, always redirecting praise to the comrades he had lost, not to himself. As the crowd began to disperse, Harold turned to Andrew. "You didn't have to do all this." "No, Harold," Andrew said firmly. "I did, because this isn't just about you. It's about every veteran. You inspired something bigger than both of us." Harold nodded, his eyes misty. "Then I'm glad I could do something that mattered." He boarded the plane for its inaugural honor flight, a symbolic journey reserved for veterans and their families. Andrew watched from outside, pride swelling in his chest like never before. His airline was no longer just a company that moved people from place to place. It had become a vessel for stories, where every passenger, every veteran, was heard and respected. As the engines roared, and the plane named after Harold Bennett lifted from the runway, Harold gazed out the window, sunlight reflecting off the letters that bore his name, and for the first time in many years, he smiled fully. Not because he was a hero, but because he had finally been seen, not just as a veteran, but as a man whose life had meant something. Andrew stood beside Samantha as they watched the aircraft disappear into the sky. "This is just the beginning," he said. Samantha nodded, eyes shining, "and it's a beginning we can all be proud of." The plane soared higher into the sky, carrying not just passengers, but a legacy of courage, respect, and the power of change born from one man and one simple act of kindness.